My name is Nicola, and you're watching Singularity FM, the place where we interview the future. If you guys enjoy this podcast, you can show your support by either writing a review on iTunes or by becoming a patron via interviewthefuture.com. Today, for the second time, my guest on the show is Professor Angus Fletcher. Angus is a neuroscientist who decided to change his career by doing a PhD on Shakespeare at Yale. Then he went to Stanford University and worked with clients in Hollywood and DARPA. Angus is the author of many books, including Wonderworks, which we discussed last time, and Story Thinking. He was recently awarded the Commendation Medal by the U.S. Army for his groundbreaking research with U.S. Special Operations. His next book, Primal Intelligence, will be published by Penguin in 2025. So welcome again to Singularity FM, Angus.
I'm so honored to be here, Nicola, and hopefully I can sustain the conversation as well as you did last time.
Thank you so much. I actually loved our previous conversation immensely. One little criticism I had towards myself is that I spoke more than I'm supposed to speak. So this time I will try to be a little more quiet and give you a lot more of the podium time. And by the way, today the topic of our conversation will be your upcoming two books, Story Thinking and Primal Intelligence. But before we begin, perhaps just to share with you a couple of the comments that you may not have seen on the previous interview. So Adam Geist here says, "This is one of the best interviews with Fletcher. This episode deserves more views." Totally agree with Kim. Another person says, "This is awesome." Holistic Hacker says, brilliant, just brilliant. Thank you so much for the inspiration. Loved every second of it. Then Ancient Novelist says, "What an enlightening and fascinating discussion. I was especially taken by the idea of a narrative as a fundamental epistemology and necessary complement to computation," etc., etc. So anyway, that's a long way of saying that, and I shouldn't be saying that, and I've never said it before, but I tend to do the opposite of what I'm supposed to do anyway. So out of 300 interviews, people often ask me, what's your favorite? And I always answer, it's like asking a parent, who's your favorite child? You know, every one of them has its pros and cons, and we all love them in a different way. I can say I've had maybe 3 dozen interviews that were outstanding and that are really dear and meaningful to me. But if I'm forced to pick a single interview that was probably the best, tying the first place now when I think of with my interview with Carl Schroeder on impact, but more on the enjoyment side than that, would be my first interview with Angus. So if you guys have not seen yet that first interview, please go and check it out because it was absolutely outstanding. And today we're trying to avoid repeating any of the stuff we did last time and just move forward from there. So that's a long introduction, Angus, but I wanted to share with you some of the feedback.
Well, that's wonderful. And I would say to you, please talk as much as you would like, because it's much better when it's a conversation. And I feel like, to the extent that I said interesting things on the last podcast, it's because you prompted me. And one thing that you and I have in common, I really believe, is that we are mavericks. We are people who sort of think outside of established paths. And I think it's just rare for me to have the opportunity to talk with someone who shares an unlike mind with me. So please feel free just to edge in anytime you like.
That's wonderful. Okay. So before we jump into the books, which would illuminate our present and hopefully our future situation and how we approach it, I'd like just to catch up a little bit with you, perhaps, because last time we spoke, you were talking about the possibility of creating a certain machine, that a machine that computes narrative rather than logic. Any update on that? How far have we gone? Have we made any progress?
Well, to be clear, it doesn't compute narrative because you can't compute narrative. But yes, the idea is that it thinks in narrative. So I have to be honest and say that we have not made significant progress on that machine because people continue to think that we're nuts. We have just, however, submitted a paper to NeurIPS, which is a fairly large computer science conference. I can't talk about that because I don't want to bias the selection process. But we are continuing to work on that. The main thing I would just say to people is we don't need a machine that thinks in story because we have 7 billion machines on this planet that think in story. And most of what I try and spend my life doing is not replacing humans with machines, but figuring out how to access more of the potential that we have inside us, because there is so much intelligence on this planet and there are so many things going wrong on this planet. And it seems like if we could get a little bit more out of all of our heads, we could have a slightly brighter future, if not a singularity.
Wow. Okay. Let's hope so, because one of the problems with our current story is that kind of belief that we can get a twist plot or a plot twist that would kind of justify our past, negative experience towards a positive outcome in the long run. I think a lot of people have lost faith in that as a possibility, and I think that perhaps is one of the most damaging part of the current story about where we are as a civilization. And perhaps where you guys are as a nation in the United States of America, even.
Yeah, well, that's brilliantly said. And that is the primordial power of narrative, is the plot twist. And the plot twist is when everything bad in the past becomes the source of everything good in the future. And that runs counter to the way that I think most political parties operate now. Most political parties now say, well, everything in the past was really good, and we have to delete the future and go back there, right? So that's one way of thinking about it. And then the other way of thinking about it is, the past was a disaster. It was filled with all of these, horrible isms, racism and all this kind of stuff. We just have to delete the past totally and start all over again, and it'll be fine. And of course, the reality of the way that growth works is growth proceeds through tension, and tension comes from seeing how where we are now is different from where we want to be, bending backwards into the past, grabbing the parts of the past that are positive, holding on to the parts that are negative, pulling them together and producing these plot twists. And that capacity, which generates wonder in the human brain, is also what generates innovation, generates progress, generates everything. And I think it's really important that we have people who are both optimistic and realistic, and who train their eyes on the past at the same time as they train their eyes on the future, and are really committed to holding the two in tension. So anyway, totally agree with everything that you're saying. And I also totally agree that that's a unique human ability and not something that we're going to get out of AI or computers or any technology we have existing at the present.
Well, that's very nice, because I stole it from you. I watched it in a 16-minute long video where you actually talk about the power of the plot twist to heal and to create that kind of optimism and outcome. Do you want to share a little bit more about that?
Sure.
Because so people may find it useful both personally and professionally and even collectively.
So that video comes as a kind of extension of the work that we were talking about last time. And so maybe to transition between the last podcast and this podcast. On the last podcast, we talked about a very high-level series of theoretical ideas about how narrative works in the brain and all this kind of stuff. And I was fairly forthright with you, and I said that this stuff comes out of my research in neuroscience, but it hasn't been tested at scale on large populations. And the opportunity that I've had since I was on the podcast last is to work with a number of large organizations, including the United States Army, and start to practice and applying some of these techniques at scale and seeing how they actually work to unlock forms of intelligence and growth in people. And so what you're referring to specifically is work that we did with individuals who are suffering from a loss of purpose. And so these were individuals who would get up in the morning. They would often be very competent at their jobs. They might be very good parents. They might be very good at everything they did. But inside, they just felt empty. They felt apathetic. They felt a total loss of meaning. They felt, to a certain extent, like they had become a machine. And this is a form of dissociation. There's different varieties of it: depersonalization, derealization, but a lot of it involves maybe feeling like you're a ghost going through your life, or that life is somehow unreal. And so I was working with this population and, having some conversations. And one day I was called up by one of the doctors at the clinic, and they said, Angus, we said, we've had this amazing breakthrough. And I said, oh, I said, you've had a breakthrough. That's great, because I wasn't involved, so I know it has to be a breakthrough. So I come, running over to the clinic, and I say, what was the breakthrough? And they said, well, they said, we were trying this thing where we ask clients to journal. We ask individuals who are in the therapy to journal and just kind of free write things that are in their minds. And I said, oh, how did that work? They said, well, it didn't work at all. They said, it didn't work at all. People were writing down their thoughts, had no effect, except this one patient was writing things down on a piece of paper. And suddenly, in the course of about 5 minutes, he totally transformed. And he regained access to his emotions. There was this cathartic moment where he shifted from being very neutral to suddenly having this enormous outpouring of both positive and negative emotion together, grief, joy simultaneously. And over the coming days, he's increasingly become more purposeful, more optimistic, more hopeful, all these kinds of things. I said, oh, wow, that's very exciting. And so they said, so, we took this piece of paper that he was writing on, and we gave it to all the other patients, because we knew that this was the secret thing, and we would give it to all the other patients. And they would, of course, have this similar transformation. And I said, oh, well, that's incredible. I said, did that happen? And they said, no, that did not happen. We gave it to the other patients, and they read it, and they said, okay, that's fine. And then they just kind of went on in this kind of fugue state. And so they said, so that's why we called you in, Angus, Dr. Fletcher, as they always like to refer to me, Dr. Fletcher, that's why we called you in. And we want you to analyze this piece of paper and tell us what's going on with it. So I sat down, I looked at the piece of paper, and I'm not going to tell you exactly what was on the piece of paper, because I don't want to violate patient confidentiality, but I can tell you broadly that the person was writing about their own life story, and they were writing about a series of very negative things in their life story, negative events. And they then suddenly had this epiphanic moment where they saw how those negative things had led to something very, very positive. And this was in their past. And so that's an example of a plot twist. Now, there's a lot of reasons why this was important and significant. The first thing that I just want to say is it was significant that it did not work on any of the other patients. And why did it not work on any of the other patients? Well, it turns out that actually the most powerful plot twists are plot twists that you have personally experienced. So if I get up in front of you and I start telling you about how I've had this amazing transformational experience in my life, and how I didn't think that I could climb mountains, but then I did climb mountains, and you always see these inspirational speakers coming on and trying to motivate people to kind of become their best selves, and you listen to them and you feel totally inspired while they're talking, and then you go home and your life doesn't change, or in fact, in a lot of cases, it actually gets worse. For the same reason that when you watch a Walt Disney movie or something like that, you feel better when you're watching the movie, but then you feel worse afterwards. Or for the same reason, if you're, drinking, you feel better while you're drinking and you feel worse afterwards. And that's because actually what's happening is you're experiencing a dissociation from your own life. And then your brain realizes that's not the real me. And then you slip backwards into a state of despair. But if you think on your own life and you go back over your own life and you realize, oh my goodness, there was a moment where something bad led to something good, you realize it can happen to me. I experienced it. And that has an absolute fidelity to your brain. And so going back over these moments and working on them and thinking on them and just kind of allowing the emotion to work on you starts to strengthen this narrative process in your brain. And the result of strengthening that narrative process is that when negative things happen to you in your life, you don't look at them as negative things. You say, okay, this could be the beginning of a plot twist. And the reason that's important is, first of all, of course, it builds optimism and all these other kinds of things, but also because the main thing that happens when we experience negative things in our life is we become overwhelmed with negative feeling. And so we just start to shut down all of our emotions. And when you shut down your negative emotions, you shut down your positive emotions. And when you shut down all of your emotions, you kind of lose your reason for existing. And this is a very common thing in the modern world because most of modern life is being part of these systems, which are bigger than us and which we don't understand. Those systems could be our job, but those systems could also just be existing as a person in the world where you do all this good stuff and then all of a sudden the world either ignores you or does something cruel and unpleasant to you. and your body decides, I've had enough of these negative feelings. I'm just going to go numb. And that's when you start to experience that loss of meaning, that loss of purpose, and all those other things. So the main point of this is, don't spend your time listening to other people's inspirational stories. Don't go around, trying to, find meaning or purpose in somebody else's life story. Go back over your own life and start to reflect on those moments where good moments came out of bad moments. And it can feel maybe a little bit goofy at first. When I first started doing this with the Army was very not into it. The Army was like, what are you talking about? I was like, no. And then, of course, the Army, being the Army, they're like, well, what about all the good moments that turned into bad moments? And they would go on these and everything. And I'd say, okay, we can talk about those in a moment. But before we start talking about those, let's go and identify some of those other moments. And then what happens is the more you kind of start to look back on your past, the more you realize there are these extraordinary things that have happened to all of us. There really are. Just miraculous moments, really. And that doesn't reveal necessarily that there's a God or that there's a purpose or a greater meaning to life. But what it does reveal is this narrative potential in biology, which I would broadly call anti-fragility, to get stronger, to get wiser from negative experiences. And the more you train your brain on your own story, the more that it realizes this really did happen to me, and it can lean into that belief without getting skeptical about it, the more that it then has this capacity to sort of grow and evolve through all the kind of challenges of life. So that's what that video was about. I probably gave you as long an explanation for it now as the actual video is, but it was a really transformative experience for me to see it happen, and then to be able to go back and get that same process to happen in other individuals at that clinic by walking them through the same process and seeing as they were able to get themselves out of these funks and become happier at their job, happier at their family, or in a lot of cases, they would quit their job and they would go do something more interesting than their job, and they would find that inner drive that satisfied them.
Yeah, this is absolutely fascinating to me, at least for two reasons. One is, very selfishly, for me as a keynote speaker, I often share my story from the stage, and this will allow me to push it to the next level. So in other words, to make it, I always try to share it in a way which makes it more relevant to the audience. But with this knowledge and this experience and this experiment in mind, and this kind of formulation, as you put it, about urging people to find the plot twist into their own past where a negative turned into a positive, I would have a lot more powerful tool to connect my story to their story and give them a tip or a practical tool to be in charge of their own story in the end of the day, which is wonderful and extremely valuable. But I'm thinking one above that even. So the plot twist works very well at the individual level based on your research and experience, and I believe that. My question is, okay, how do we make that work at the aggregate level? How do we make that work to heal not one vet coming from, the battlefield, but a nation that is struggling to find a meaning and purpose and is tearing itself apart? How do we find a way to make this work for a civilization that seems to be bent on self-destruction, on wars amongst each other, on, nuclear brinkmanship, even rejuvenated since the Cold War, on like all kinds of negative narratives that are all kind of professing our doom with absolute certainty, if you will, and with complete lack of hope. So can we do that somehow? And if we can, how do we translate that?
I mean, that is a brilliant question. That's one of the reasons I enjoy coming on this podcast, Nicholas, because that's, of course, the level of scale that I don't naturally think on. I'm very much focused on individual brains. So let me say a couple things, and then you tell me if you have ideas, because I'd love to hear them. The first thing I will say is, when I do keynotes, because I'm always asked to do keynotes too, and I really hate doing keynotes because I hate talking about myself and I hate talking in public in general. I always find it very anxiety inducing. And so I've started to do this thing in keynotes where I actually talk for a little bit and then I force the audience to do things. So I'll often force them to think back on their lives, reflect on their lives, come up with these moments, and then I will force them to share them with the person next to them. And what's really remarkable about that is we know from teaching that students never remember anything the teacher says. but students always remember what they themselves, the student says. And it's the same thing with those keynotes. When I give those keynotes, people come up to me, months, years afterwards, and they say, that was such an affecting keynote. And I say, oh, thank you. I say, what do you remember from it? And they say, well, I don't remember anything that you said, but I do remember this story that I told myself in the keynote. And so I think that process is sort of the process that I sort of, focus on. To your larger question about how do we get collectives to go through this, part of that is that they have to go through a collective plot twist. They have to think of a time when they all experienced something bad becoming something good. And I think when you look back on earlier generations of Americans, so I'm not actually an American, I'm a naturalized citizen, but I tend to think of myself in terms of American history because I've lived here for a while. When you think back in terms of American experience, World War II is very strong in the American mind as one of those moments. And that was partly because many, many people in America were involved in the war. It was a very dark war, and a lot of really negative things happened. But then out of it came this sense of America as this country that could help the world and could help back democracy and these other kinds of things. And so part of what I think we need to have, to your point, is we need to have people engage more deeply and more fundamentally in these collective activities. We need to pull more people in. What's happened now is people spend so much time on the sidelines watching and judging as opposed to participating. So if I had any recommendation, I would say get together a group of people and try and get them to do these challenging things and find positive experience out of hard times, and then start to try and grow your group. And on a national level, stop looking to politicians to fix your life. Stop looking to people to give you things. Instead, ask, how can we participate collectively to solve a problem? And don't wait to be told, just do what people do in democracies, which is just start trying to solve the problem and start to solve it at scale. And that will naturally kind of pull you into this process. So I know that's not a great answer because you're talking to someone whose expertise is individual brains. My expertise is not societies. But I think that the way you build collective narratives is you engage more people in these processes. And ultimately that happens because a group of people just starts.
Well, I'll venture a couple of things here. One for you as a speaker and one on the larger question we're discussing. So your kind of level of enjoyment may improve tremendously, and your angst may diminish tremendously, or at least it happened for me the moment when I realized that I'm not going up on the stage for me, I'm going for them. So once I realized I'm not here for me, I'm here for them, then everything was about them, and I totally forgot about me, especially once I'm on stage. It's all about them. And so even if I'm sharing my story a little bit, it's a story of me, but it's not about me. It's about them. So, and that removed any and all pressure from me, because I'm there basically to serve in a way, or to be there for them in any way that I can, in any capacity that I can. So try that. I mean, you may have tried it, I don't know, but that helped me tremendously get over that. Secondly, on the larger point, on the larger question, it occurs to me that there may have been something similar to that in Canadian history. You're naturalized American, I'm a naturalized Canadian, and Canada is supposed to be born on the battlefields of northern Belgium in World War I in two places. One is called Vimy Ridge, and the other is called Passchendaele, where there was the famous slaughter in the mud, where something like over 300,000 British and French troops were slaughtered by the German machine guns, to the point where the French almost rebelled and refused to go and, charge the German machine gun nests anymore. And then the British, who were in charge of the Canadian troops, decided that the Canadians are going to take over those 2 points. And the Canadians said, yes, we will try to do that, but on the condition we do it our way. So we're not going to have British generals commandeer the Canadian troops. We're going to have Canadian officers commandeer our own troops. And they were successful at taking, and that was the worst place of the war in one of the worst moments of the war. 300,000 troops were lost in a sort of like a 3-mile stretch or something like that. And the Canadians were able to take it, I think, with something like 3 or 4,000 people dead. And they did it their own way. But supposedly that was the birth of the nation, because that forced the split between the Canadian armed forces and the British armed forces. And it told them, and it told us, we are different. We're our own people. We are in charge of our own selves. We would command our own selves. And we have allies and friends, but we're different. And so that's considered to be, in historical terms, the birth of the nation of Canada. And so maybe that fits a little bit of that plot twist, like the worst moment where you're sent to certain death facing the German machine guns, and yet you find a way around it. And in the end of it, you have the birth of the nation.
I think that's totally fascinating. And I think that war for many populations is the epicenter of their national consciousness, their narrative, their story of who they are. And a large part of that is because war requires everything. I mean, it's this life and death intensity. And because of that life and death intensity, it draws you into your most tragic moments, but it also pulls out of you these spectacular possibilities and these spectacular capacities. We were talking about the United States experience of World War II, and how is it that the United States won World War II? Well, the answer is their industrial capacity. That industrial capacity is what supported the Soviet Union during the various German invasions, through the Land-Lease program, and kind of helped stabilize that. Then, of course, that industrial capacity is what allowed for the Western Front and North Africa. And then, how do you get that industrial capacity? How do you increase that industrial capacity? Well, the answer is women. Women in factories. And that revolution, and you can see that in the... That's exactly right. And so the moment that the United States decided this is a total war in the sense that everyone's going to participate, then you could get that industrial scale, because all of a sudden you double the size of the workforce, you double the size of the factories, you just had this just tremendous increase, and everyone came together to make everything, and everyone came together to support war rationing and to support war bonds and all these kinds of things. And so even though the United States was very, very far away from the war in a literal sense, it became the epicenter of their national consciousness. And when you look around the world now, that's not the way that things work. When you look around the world now, when something goes wrong, people's immediate reactions are, one, to blame somebody, say, "Oh, this is your fault," and then to look to somebody else who can fix the problem for them. And that's not the way that narratives are constructed. What instead you have to say is, how can I take responsibility for this thing that isn't my fault? That's actually the first step.
In other words, we have to become the protagonists of the story, because the protagonist is the person who solves the problem.
That's exactly right. And so in psychology, this is a famous concept, which I'm sure you're aware of, called locus of control. Is this something you've talked about on your podcast before? Locus of control? Agency, yeah. So basically, it's this, psychological concept, which is, where's the place which controls action and agency? Is it outside me or is it inside me? And what we find with people is that people tend to be happier when they assume locus of control and they say, I'm in charge. And so even if bad things are happening to you, if you say, I'm responsible for these things, then that tends to make you happier and tends to empower you more. And this, of course, can be, the source of things that can seem ludicrous. I mean, in the ancient world, things could go wrong and people will say, it's because we've sinned. We've done terrible things. That's why we had this thunderstorm. That's why we had this plague. But psychologically, that actually helped them, because they said, okay, there's something we can do about this, as opposed to them saying, oh, woe is me, or even worse, it's that person's fault. She's a witch. Let's burn her. which is another thing you could do, right? You said, say, oh, it's me. I'm going to search my soul. I'm going to search my conscience. How can I be a better person? And to your point, yes, you have to become the protagonist of your own story. You can't let anyone else be the protagonist of your story. And you have to seek negative things as opportunities for you to be that hero. And you have to stop thinking of negative things as interrupting your life. And you have to start seeing them as the chance for greatness.
Yeah, we're going to start here, use that long digression to transition to our present and future moment, your work and how it relates to AI technology and where we find ourselves in the world as individuals and professionals. But, as you said, we have to start embracing problems. I struggle with this every morning, every single morning for the last, how long? Maybe 3 years, over 3 years now. I do cold water immersions, and I never got used to it. I freaking hate it every morning. I struggle with it. And I tell myself as I go, and if I start arguing with it, if I start arguing with myself in a logical manner, I lose, in the sense that I end up skipping it. So I've learned, don't reason with it, just go. And the second thing is, tell yourself, I love the suck, because it sucks so much. And I'm just like, I love the suck. I love the suck. I love the suck. And I'm like counting 2 minutes, 2.5 minutes. If I can do 3 minutes or more, I'm super happy. But I'm telling myself I love the suck. It hasn't clicked in yet after 3 years. I hate it still every morning, but I'm kind of embracing that problem and trying to twist in a positive story in my head and saying, you're loving the suck.
Yeah. Well, if you did like it, it wouldn't be having the same positive effect. So let's talk about this for a second, because this is fascinating. The reality is that cold water immersion is bogus scientifically. Like, you're not actually making yourself any better by immersing yourself in cold water in the morning. But if you choose to do something hard in the morning, the first thing you get up, you are doing something positive for yourself. And so if you dislike going in a cold bath and you put yourself in it, and you embrace that, that has an enormous salutary effect on your brain. I don't do that. I do something that's maybe even weirder. I have this rowing machine that I row on, and I row for 90 minutes in the morning. And
wow.
It's not like fast. I'm not like an athlete or anything, as anyone can see when they look at me. I'm definitely not an athlete, but people often say to me, oh, Angus, you must really like rowing if you're doing 90 minutes of rowing a day. And I say, the first thing that I think of when I wake up in the morning is, oh God, I have to go on the rowing machine. I do not want to do that, because rowing machines, they were like designed by someone to be both physically painful and psychologically painful, because it's so boring. It's the most boring activity you can do, at least for me. I don't want to insult any rowers out there. I used to be a runner. I loved running. You'd go out in nature and see all these exciting things, be sort of transformative psychologically. I hate rowing, but the more that I've done this activity, the stronger I've got when I've been off the rowing machine, because I just realize, oh my goodness, like, I can do it. I can totally do it. And no matter how irritating life gets, I'm always like, at least I'm not on the rowing machine, like, I feel so much, I sleep better, because when I used to be, when I would get into bed, I'd be like, I'd be thinking about all these problems that I have. And now I'm like, oh my goodness, you're not on the rowing machine, man. This is great. I just fall right asleep. So, and when I talk to soldiers, one of the first things they often say to me, Angus, you look a little stressed, you look a little anxious, you look like, today isn't perfect. So let me ask you, Angus, is somebody about to die? And I say, no. And then Alexa, what are you worried about? And you realize that they've been on these battlefields.
Yeah.
And they've had that moment.
When somebody dies, or they know someone will die.
That's right. And I talked this very arresting story recently with an individual where he was the last person to see a teammate alive, and that teammate was going to do something, and they knew in their heart that it was likely they were going to die, and that teammate gave them something to pass on to their children. He said, I'm going to take this item off my person and give it to you, and I want you to give it to my kids, and just having that moment in your mind, and then realizing that's not where we are right now. Like, no matter, you might be stuck in traffic, you might have just had, an unpleasant encounter with someone in your life, whatever, but you're not about to die. And then the moment you realize that, you're like, okay, I can take it. And it's the same thing in a different way with the cold bath or the rowing machine or whatever. By voluntarily running into these negative experiences, you remind your brain, hey, I can choose to do hard things. I can choose to do negative things. I can choose to do unpleasant things. And as a result of that, I am the hero of my own story. I have control.
Yeah, and yes, psychologically, it makes me feel like I just accomplished something freaking that's beyond me. And you would think I'd get used to it, but actually, in some ways, I'm getting even more fearful on some days because I know what's waiting for me, and I'm not looking forward to it. And I just go, "Oh, love the suck! I love the suck," and I go in because if I stop to think about it, it's over. I can't think. I can't reason. So perhaps that's the time now we should sort of transition and start thinking about or talking about how story thinking and primal intelligence can inform the way we see ourselves in the world today, where we're going, and how we relate to computers, artificial intelligence, and technology in general. So let's start step by step. First, we'll start with story thinking, which is your book that I was able to listen to in full, and I enjoyed tremendously. The new one I haven't read because it hasn't become available yet. I did do your quiz, and I'm going to share the embarrassing result afterwards with you so that you would see where I got zero. But anyway, so
at least you didn't get -10. I've gotten -10 on parts of that test before, just so you know, it's possible.
Okay. So I got zero somewhere, but we'll get to that later. So, okay. So first of all, story thinking. It would seem that you're saying that story is not just for telling, because people would say story is for telling. You're telling a story. People tell stories, but you're saying story thinking. So in other words, you're saying story is not just for telling, it's actually for thinking. How does that make any sense?
Well, we talked about this a little bit on the last podcast, where we sort of talked about this sort of like odd thing, which is that people say, well, story is so effective at communicating, and yet our ability to tell verbal stories is quite recent evolutionarily. So why is it that this really ancient brain we have would somehow be so able to understand stories? And the reality is, as we talked about in that podcast, it's because the brain naturally thinks in stories. And what do we mean by that? Well, what the brain is constantly doing is it's constantly generating actions, and it's constantly sequencing actions. And it's also trying to figure out where the actions around it came from and where they are going. So the brain is constantly telling these stories, and stories are a form of low information intelligence. So unlike what a computer does, where it has thousands and thousands of data points and tries to find patterns and use those to sort of make predictions about the future, what story does is it operates on one or two actions, and it tries to guess the cause. And then having guessed the cause, it tries to leap forward in time and guess what the effect would be. And so this is the cycle. And so the way I often explain to people is I say, well, when you're in school, what are you taught about stories? You're taught that stories go beginning, middle, end. They have these three parts: beginning, middle, end. And that is, of course, completely wrong. Because actually, the way that story works in your brain is it starts in the middle. How does it start in the middle? Well, you're walking along and something surprising happens, and your attention is drawn to that event, and you realize that you're in the middle of a story. Something you didn't expect to happen has just happened. And what your brain does in that moment is it jumps backwards and tries to imagine the beginning, and then it leaps forward and tries to anticipate the ending. So story evolved in the human brain to go middle, beginning, end, middle, beginning, end. And that cycle involves processes which are normally known as counterfactual and causal thinking. Causal thinking is kind of speculating from causes, and counterfactual thinking is changing one thing and seeing how that affects the outcome. And so the human brain has evolved over time to constantly be imagining things in the past that it hasn't seen before, and then leaping forward to imagine things in the future that it thinks might be possible based on what's happening in the present. And it's that dynamic process. And that process is what allows us to make plans. And that dynamic and plans are, at least I believe, the basis of intelligence. I think plans are essentially why intelligence evolved. The ability to make a plan is the ability to act intentionally. It's the ability to influence your environment. And so the point of the book is that we spend all of this time in school being taught these two lies. The first lie is that stories for communicating. And then the second lie is that, well, if story is for communicating, then what is for thinking? Well, then what's for thinking must be logic. And the way that things should work, according to what I think is the big lie, is that we should sit in school learning facts and truths and deducting using logical methods reality. And then when we encounter someone who's an idiot, who doesn't have our powers of logic, we then explain it to them in a story so they can understand, right? And so this is the kind of idea. And the reality is that that's not true at all. That the smartest, most intelligent people in the world are using powers such as hypothesis and various forms of imagination in order to speculate on why things are and how they could be. The moment you enter in any detailed sense into any scientific activity. So a good example of this, I think, is dinosaurs. When you're a kid, you believe, because you go to the Natural History Museum, that these paleontologists have discovered all these huge dinosaurs and know exactly how they operate, and that there's this enormous science, which is incredibly specific about how all these dinosaurs work and operate. Then you actually get involved in paleontology and you realize our entire understanding of an entire branch of dinosaurs is based on an ankle bone that someone has discovered. And off the basis of that ankle bone, they imagine backwards to where it came from. They imagine forwards, what could it do? That's why our understanding of dinosaurs evolves sometimes radically, like this understanding that maybe they all had feathers, these kinds of things that suddenly happen out of nowhere. And it's because all of these human activities, all this human intelligence isn't based in logically compiling huge amounts of information and then, sharing it to people through story, but it's driven at its root by having very small pieces of information and using imagination to fill in the rest of it. And that process of imagination doesn't mean that you're suddenly just making things up willy-nilly. What it means is that you're creating hypotheses that you can test because you have an understanding of the underlying mechanics. You're positing laws of cause and effect that are specific, that are precise. And then you use those hypotheses to develop experiments that you look to see if they produce counterintuitive results. And if they do that, you say, the law that I came up with is probably correct, and so on and so forth. So that, in a nutshell, is what I mean when I say the brain thinks in story.
That's wonderful. So, and actually it reminds me to the fact that most, if not all, of my major decisions in life, like the choice to leave Bulgaria when I was 22, then I went to study in the United States for a year, and the choice to leave the United States and come in Canada, and then to ask to marry my wife. All of those were not rational, logical choices. Those were highly emotional choices, highly intuitive choices. Those were choices like when I was in Bulgaria, I was 20 years old, came out of the army, my mom died from cancer when I was 13, and my dad sort of started drinking. So I left home actually when I was 13 and a half. But I ended up living in an apartment that I had inherited from my mom. So I had an apartment to live. I had a very good job, considered at the time to be a very good job at the reception of a hotel, the first private hotel in my city, which was the second largest city, because I spoke English. So I was making, and we were in a situation of hyperinflation where, let's say, my friend's dad, who was a doctor, head of a hospital, was making like $8 a month, and I would make $100 a month or $150 a month as a receptionist of a hotel. And I had a girlfriend that was very good looking and this and that. So people would tell me, you're totally nuts. Like, you have an apartment to live. You have an amazing job. You have an amazing girlfriend. What's wrong with you? Why do you want to leave Bulgaria? Like, you have it all set up for you. Like, you're totally nuts. Like, how would you leave this? This makes no sense. It's not logical. It's unreasonable, right? And I would tell them, like, the apartment that you're talking about is like, I can't live in it, and I don't own the whole of it. It's kind of complicated. I own 3/4. But secondly, it's not a place where I want to live for the rest of my life. The job I don't want to do for the rest of my life too. I mean, it's nice when you're 20, but it's not going to be the same when you're 40 or 60. And finally, like, we have an understanding with my girlfriend, this is not the relationship either of us is looking for to like in the long run. So like I made this emotional decision to leave, and it's been one of the best decisions in my life. And by the way, it goes to the previous point we were discussing, that negative experiences in the past lead to a positive outcome, which at the time you don't realize, right? The death of you, what seems like the death of you eventually ends up the birth of you, right? So when my mom died when I was 13 and my dad started drinking, one day he kicked the shit out of me. I left home at 13 and a half. That was kind of like the end of me in some ways, right? My mom died, poor relationship with my dad. I was like living with my cousin. It was like sort of up in the air. I was like totally angry and kind of aimless and stuff. But all of those things brought me to where I am today. And I have a very good life. I love my wife. We've been together for 21 years. And it all happened because of that kind of primordial, formational, utterly negative experience. God knows I would have never left Bulgaria if my mom was still alive, and my dad wouldn't have started drinking and all of this. So I wouldn't be where I am today, right? And so the person I am was triggered to become by the unfolding of those events. So that was a blessing for me in a way, or forging in a way of who I am as an individual and as a character, right? Yeah. So you want to say something?
Yeah, no. Well, first of all, thank you for sharing that story. That's a beautiful and affecting story. And of course, the story worked out that way because you took authorship of your own life in those moments. But you're right that those negative prompts were necessary to make you realize that the power you had inside you. And it's that strange duality of your environment creating the opportunity through these negative crises that then elicits the sense in yourself that I have the potential to handle it. I mean, I won't go too far into my own backstory, but a similar experience in that when I was a young person, my sister died, and that caused a real fracture in my family. And my dad, who's a very kind person, also had kind of a substance problem at the time because of my sister's death, and that led to this kind of unraveling. And I realized in that moment that I sort of had to take charge of my own life essentially, and I did so in a much less radical way than you did. I'm very in awe of what you did, but I did have this sudden transition where I said, oh, I now have to take my life seriously. And part of what's happening there is, of course, just like we were talking about before, it is this anti-fragility thing. But there's something else that's happening there, which I think is interesting, which is the difference between probability and possibility. And so probability is how logic works, and possibility is how narrative works. And people who don't understand story will often say, well, so is a possibility like a low probability? Is a possibility like a 10% probability? And the answer is no, it's a totally ontologically different phenomenon. So a probability is based on things that have happened in the past. And based on how many times those things have happened in the past, you can calculate how likely they are to happen again in the future. A possibility is something that has never happened before. Mm-hmm. It has never happened before. But what makes it possible is it does not violate the laws of your environment. So, a simple example would be the airplane or something like that. There had never been airplanes before, but why were they possible? Well, because it doesn't violate the environment to have a wing that allows you to take off. So it's possible, but it's not probable. There's no way to calculate the probability that people will develop an airplane. And the reason that this is important is because when people get caught in logic, what they're always doing is they're always saying, well, I have to take the best possible thing that exists now. The best thing that can happen is the slate of options that I'm seeing in front of me. So to take the case of your childhood, the options are I could become, this poor father who's working at a hospital who's suffering from hyperinflation, is probably going home every day in this state of crisis, or I could be this young man with this attractive girlfriend who's working at this hotel, who's probably getting money, I'm imagining, from tourists or whatever, who aren't experiencing the same hyperinflation problem. And so therefore you have this kind of, this extra stream of capital. And between those two choices, obviously, I want to take the young man who works the desk. Whereas when you have an imagination, when you think in possibility, you say, there are other options. I don't have to go with probability. I don't have to go with the choices that are on the table. I can create a new story I can create a new path and I can do that. And that's, of course, what you did. And so that story, I think, really beautifully illustrates the difference between probability and possibility, but also the difference between what happens when we think like a computer and we get trapped in the past, and we think like a human being and we make better futures.
Yeah. Talk to me a little bit about how computers differ from humans and how logic differs from story.
So the thing to understand about computers is that they're designed to crunch large amounts of data. They were basically invented to help companies keep track of numbers. They're accounting devices. And ENIAC, the first computer that was actually built in the 1940s, was used to do complicated math problems and things like that. So what they do is they take large amounts of data and they find patterns in them. And as we talked about in the last podcast, this is something the human brain can do too. This is something we do in terms of our visual cortex. Our visual cortex takes in a huge amount of information from our eyes and detects patterns in it. What the human brain evolved to do is not to find patterns, it's to invent new opportunities for action. And that's why story is important. So why is it important to invent new opportunities for action? Well, because life is not logical, it is biological. And in a biological world, you are constantly being surrounded by other entities which are learning and mastering the current rules of the game and then trying to go one step beyond them. So you'll see this. The internet is a good example of this because anytime anyone comes up with a clever way to promote themselves or do anything, it's immediately stolen by everybody else across the internet. And the way that life works is the moment that a new, an effective form of behavior is developed, it immediately gets stolen by everybody else. And so that means that we're in this constantly competitive environment where everyone is mastering what worked yesterday. And to survive, you have to invent something new that people aren't expecting. And that's what allows you to disrupt other people's anticipations and kind of, win your own little part of life. And that creativity, that ability to innovate action is why story developed. And to kind of go back to story thinking, the book, and kind of go forward to primal intelligence, what I started to become interested in is, okay, the human brain does this naturally. The human brain is naturally good at imagining new plans. That's what it evolved to do. However, people today are terrible at it. People today are not good at coming up with new plans. We're much worse now on average than we were 100, 200 years ago. If you put the average person in a situation where they have to think adaptively, they will freeze and experience a lot of stress. And so clearly this is an ability that can be lost. So the first question is, why is it being lost? And then the second question is, can it be improved? And so one of the things I got interested in how does this work mechanically in the human brain? And then once we understand how it works mechanically in the human brain, can we train it up so that we can make it so that children now experience less anger and anxiety in their lives? And that all the rest of us are more able when things go wrong to come up with plans that work for us and that are effective. And so when we talked last time, I was talking about a lot of the theory behind that, and I'd be happy to talk about more of the theory now, if you'd like. And all that theory is in the book Story Thinking, and it kind of walks through. But the big breakthrough for me has come in the fact that U.S. Army Special Operations knocked on my door, and they said, Angus, we'd like to test your theory. And I, of course, jumped at this because they operate in these environments where they have a plan. The operators jump out of the helicopter. They know exactly what they're going to do. And the moment they jump out of the helicopter, the unexpected occurs, the plan breaks, and they've got to make a new plan. And their lives are this constant process of making new plans, making new plans, making new plans. And so I was like, this is incredible. First of all, even if I'm unable to do anything useful for Army Special Operations, I can just learn everything about the way that their brains work. And so I can take that back to young people and to other people and start to explain, here's how you develop your narrative cognition. Here's how you develop your ability to imagine. And I can just take all of that and be useful to people. But the incredible thing is Army Special Operations was so open that they allowed me to go in and work with these units. And we were able to discover ways to take individuals who were already operating at a very high level and get better. And I can't take all the credit for this. One of the sort of funniest moments of my life is when I had just been contacted by the U.S. Army, and this was at the time when, first of all, they weren't sure that they believed anything that I was saying because they didn't understand any of the theory at all. I mean, they're smart at the Army, but I mean, my stuff is very arcane and esoteric, and they were like, we have no idea if this guy's totally nuts or not. You know what I mean? So they didn't know if they trusted me. And meanwhile, I, of course, when I first got contacted by U.S. Army Special Operations, I thought, oh my goodness, like, am I being recruited to be a spy? As I've already told you, I'm a naturalized citizen, so I'm not, a born American, and so I always get nervous when I get called up by the U.S. government because I always think they're going to throw me out of the country or something. You know what I mean? Like they've decided to revoke my citizenship. So at the beginning, both of us were a little bit unsure what to make of the other, and they walked me into this classroom, and it was at this secured military facility. Technically, the classroom didn't even exist. Technically, the people that I was teaching, weren't part of the Army. All these kinds of things. And it was a really spectacular, fascinating building. I can't say too much about it, but what I can say is that it was built out of parts of other buildings from other parts of the world, essentially. Sort of other famous missions maybe that the Army has been involved in, and this kind of stuff. And so you were just surrounded by all of these artifacts taken from around the world that were involved in these kinds of famous military campaigns. Very sort of awe-inspiring building, very, very beautiful, very fascinating. And I'm standing in front of this classroom, and I've got this chalkboard, and I'm doing what I'm doing with you now. I'm diagramming the brain and how it works, and all the different ways in which neurons engage in story thinking and all this kind of stuff. And I'm talking about all this kind of stuff. And after about half an hour of this, the operators just look at me with this complete blank stare. And it's not that they don't understand, it's that they don't even care. And I had this moment where I was like, oh my goodness, like every other professor on the planet, I'm actually an idiot, like, because it's kind of your job as a professor to have these really complicated ideas because you spent all this time in a room reading books, and then you walk out into the real world and it turns out everything you thought is totally nuts. You're like, oh, I can solve all these problems. And then it's like, you can't solve any problems, man. You can't even buy yourself lunch. So I was like, oh my God, I was like, this is so dispiriting. I'm the thing. But at that exact moment, one of the instructors came over, and the instructor came over, and he basically kind of barked at the trainees, and he goes, "What the professor is saying is this," and he took everything that I had said and kind of explained it to them using these Army terms, which I'd never heard before. And then all of a sudden they were like, "Oh yeah," And then I had this moment where I was so emotionally both kind of relieved and sort of joyful this moment that I almost cried. I was like, "Oh my goodness!" And I suddenly realized in that moment that I had found my people. That they understood me and I understood them, and there had been this kind of communication gap, but we had solved it. And from that moment on, I proceeded to be able to work with these teams and help to train them up and do these kinds of very kind of small things, and they got better and better and better and better. And as they were getting better and better and better, they kept crediting me, and they kept saying, "Angus, this is great, we love what you're doing." But really most of what I was doing is I was just kind of stealing stuff from them, and also from their instructors, because their instructors knew 99% of what I came in with, but they hadn't understood it in terms of the brain and neural operations. They just understood it in terms of when we, do this training exercise, this is the result. And I was able to kind of start to formalize and integrate and extend a lot of the things they were doing because, I had this scientific understanding of the brain. And so the kind of net result of that was that we developed this theory of imagination that we then translated into practical training. And that training makes your brain faster at creating effective plans. And why is this important? Well, the reason this is important, of course, if you're an Army Special Operator, you can go off and do all this stuff across the world. But I personally am not an Army Special Operator. And one of the sources of tension between me and the Army is I don't like guns. I don't like violence. And so we're always having these meetings in which we're talking about stuff. And I actually have been involved in a number of post-mission debriefings where you actually, you see, with helmet cams or whatever, stuff happening. And I always find it very alarming and upsetting, to be honest with you. I don't like military events. I mean, I understand and I believe that they are necessary in certain circumstances, but it's not something that I love. So for me, the main point of this was not to develop even more elite special operators. The more important part of this was to take it back into the general population. And so we started taking this stuff back, this ability to imagine and make plans. We started taking it back to schools. And the reason we took it back to schools is the two biggest problems that you see now among young kids. I don't know if you have kids, but you probably have at least seen some out on the street. So you're probably aware of kids and what they're going through. And the two main problems that kids today suffer from are anger and anxiety. It's that simple. So if you go into a school setting, kids will be stressed, they'll be anxious, and this can, in their minds reach kind of debilitating proportions where they become so stressed and so anxious that they can't function and they feel like they might need to be medicated. This is a kind of a common thing. And the other problem is this kind of aggression, kind of restless energy, anger problem, which also then leads often to people saying, well, you have ADHD or you have this other problem and you need to be medicated. So these are these two problems that we just see a lot in schools, anger and anxiety. Well, what are anger and anxiety? They are the two faces of your fight or flight response. That's all they are. They are fight or flight. And this is this ancient part of the brain, the amygdala essentially is where this occurs. And what's happening when you have a fight or flight response? You're experiencing a threat. It's that simple. Your brain perceives a threat. So how do you solve that? How do you solve that? Well, the way that we're told to solve it now is that you have to remove the threat. That's what we're taught the answer is. And so we're told the answer is we've got to create safe spaces, emotional safe spaces. We're told that we have to engage in relentlessly positive thinking the whole time. We're taught that we have to do mindfulness and meditation and other forms of dissociative practice. So we kind of, create this kind of psychic wall between ourselves and the threat. And, that would be fine if that worked. I'm not morally opposed to any of those things, but that's not what the human brain evolved to do. The human brain evolved to eat threats. It evolved to eat threats and turn them into plans. That's what your brain is constantly doing. So when your brain experiences a threat, what it wants to do is, how can I make a plan to deal with this threat? And the moment that your brain makes a plan, it does not experience anxiety or anger because it's exited the threat response and is moving forward. And I discovered this in the most kind of spectacularly surprising way when I was working with the operators, because the operators are constantly hitting threats. I mean, that's almost their entire job is to run into threats, yet they don't experience anxiety or anger when they're in these situations. And so you could walk into Army Special Operations and take out a grenade and put it on the table. No anxiety, no anger. You can pull the pin out of the grenade and put it in the middle of the table. No anxiety, no anger. Why? Because they have a plan. They know exactly what to do, right? They know exactly how to handle this problem. And so as fast as they can come up with a plan, the anger and the anxiety dissipates. And so when our kids are struggling with these problems, the answer is not to remove the threats, because the reality is the more that you remove the threats, the less children learn how to deal with threats, the less they learn how to make plans. They instead learn that threats are bad and that when I experience a threat, I have to get away from it somehow, right? That's the answer, as opposed to I have to run into the threat. And so what we do now with kids is we teach them the same ability to make plans when they're confronted with a threat. We say, don't run away from the plan. Don't run away from the threat. Make a plan. Be a special operator. And what we find is that the more the kids do this, unsurprisingly, they experience less anger, they experience less anxiety, they have more resilience, all these kinds of things. And that all comes from imagination, because a plan comes from imagination. And that all comes from narrative cognition, or learning to think in story. And so the fastest way to kind of nurture these behaviors in kids is just to feed them stories about realistic situations that contain characters who are different from themselves. So they learn to think like other characters. Like, what would I do if I was this character in this situation? Not a superhero, but a real person, right? Because you're not a superhero. You can't just use magic to solve problems, but a real person. We often give them books like Henry Huggins or things like that, and books that are filled with plot twists and other kinds of surprises, because then your brain learns, oh, life is full of twists. It's not supposed to be like a stable, safe space where nothing bad happens. It's supposed to be a space where things are constantly unstable and uncertain, and I embrace that as a source of growth. So that was a very long answer to your question, but basically, that is the work. That's how the theoretical work in a book like Story Thinking has been applied and tested in these other contexts, validated through the U.S. Army through a variety of trials, which I can talk about if you're interested, but then taken back into classrooms. And the whole goal here is to reverse what has happened in the modern school system, which is not just removing threats, but also emphasizing logic and math and standardized assessments and all these kinds of things, which deplete the brain's ability to think in narrative, and so take away the root ability that humans have to cope with reality. So that's kind of what I've been doing in terms of applying story thinking.
It's absolutely brilliant, and it's applied in the most kind of extreme of situations with the highest of stakes, life and death. every single time. So if it works there, you would think should work pretty much everywhere. But my audience is mostly tech geeks and very sophisticated people who might want to improve their imagination. What would you recommend would be the resource for them to go to? Is it Story Thinking, the book, or do you have another manual for it?
So they can read Story Thinking if they'd like. Story Thinking is written for philosophers. So maybe I'll explain for a second what story thinking, like why it exists, because people might pick it up and be like, what is going on with this book and what lunatic created it? And then I'll give them some free resources so they don't actually have to go out and buy any of my books if they don't want to improve their imagination.
What about the manual?
The training manual, the creative. So I can talk about that too, and they can also purchase that. Yeah. Okay, but story thinking, just to give people a sense, that was commissioned by philosophers. Philosophers came to me. And the reason that they came to me is they said, look, Angus, there's this real problem in philosophy, which is that philosophy is a failure. It's a failure. We have the smartest people in the world are attracted to philosophy. They've been working for centuries and really for thousands of years in a very rigorous level. And yet philosophy contributes almost nothing to the modern world. I mean, it was supposed to kind of provide all of these answers. And most of what philosophy has done is deconstruct itself and collapse into, movements like metaethics and whatnot in the 20th and 21st century. And so they said, we're having this real problem that we don't know what's gone wrong with philosophy. It's not working. And they said, attendant on that is this problem that what thinks like a philosopher is a computer. Both philosophers and computers use logic, and not just in the colloquial sense of the word logic, but literally. So for people who don't know, logic is a very formal system. I mean, we use it colloquially to refer to anything that kind of makes sense to us, but it's a very formal, rigorous system. It's codified by Aristotle. And computer hard drives are essentially all running and or not operations. That's what they're running. They're simplified into NAND or NOR gates and things like that. So it's a very simple set of these logical procedures. And so if philosophy seems like it's the smartest thing, yet it completely fails practically. And now we're doing the same thing, only at great scale with AI, like literally the same thing. And we're constantly being told this thing is so intelligent. How is it not going to also fail catastrophically? How is it not going to be this same kind of mirage? And they said, so we want you to write this book because you have this alternate perspective. And so what happens in the book, first of all, what I do in the book is I explain why philosophy has failed and what the alternative is. And so there's that in there, and I can talk through that a little bit. But the main point of the book is that each chapter is a slightly more complicated story than the last chapter. And so each chapter contains slightly more characters than the chapter before it, contains a slightly different narrative voice, and contains slightly more plot twists in it. And so the point of the book is that even if you don't believe anything inside the book, it nevertheless leads you through these narrative processes, which help make you aware of all these intelligent functions and operations you have inside your own brain. And therefore, by doing that, you learn experientially by reading the book about how narrative works, even if you disagree with everything that's on the page. So that's kind of the idea behind the book. And then in terms of the specific question that it sets out to answer, if you go through the early chapters of the book, what it talks about is it talks about the rise of philosophy. Like, why do we even have philosophy? Why does it even exist? Well, the reason it exists is because in the ancient world, we used to have something called wisdom literature. So if you go back into any culture, they will have these remarkable stories and texts all across the world. And these stories were retold at spiritual events, but they were also retold around hearths and in homes. And, you can find them if you want, ancient examples of them, in the Hebrew Bible.
The Bhagavad Gita.
The Bhagavad Gita, all of these, And basically the point of them is you read these stories and you become wiser. And that's because these stories are focused on ethics. So they're focused on the problem of how do we live in the world? What is a good life? And they tell you these stories that help you live a better life. Well, around 2,000 years ago, a little bit more, maybe about 2,500 years ago, so a group of people called the philosophers came around and they said, we can do it better than wisdom literature. We can do it better. And the beginning point for this is really Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. That's when we start to really kind of get the beginning of this, at least in the West. And what they do is they start to shift things. And they start to say, well, let's not focus on ethics. Let's instead focus on metaphysics. Because metaphysics is the foundation, they argued, for ethics. So instead of thinking about, what should I do in a daily context, let's think actually about what's right and wrong in a kind of a galactic sense. And let's stop spending all this time with stories. I mean, stories are ridiculous, right? What is that about? We instead need a truth apparatus, which allows us to determine what is absolutely right and what is absolutely wrong. And they came up with the idea that that would be arguments. So instead of telling stories, you and I are going to have arguments, debates. And then they realized that they could formalize those arguments into these logical processes. And this transition really occurs. And if your audience is interested, they can go back and read this, not in my book, but in the History of Philosophy, if they're interested. This really happens with a book that Aristotle writes called The Topics. And what happens in The Topics is Aristotle gets really interested in Socrates, and particularly in Socrates' dialogic method. So, I mean, as you and I have talked about, Nicola, what happens with Socrates is he has a conversation with people. And over the course of that conversation, people somehow get smarter through a dialogue. And Aristotle said, well, what if I could take a dialogue between two people and reduce that to a logical argumentative process that could be essentially plugged into a computer? He didn't have a computer then, but he had this idea that it could be automated. And so he turned dialogue into dialectic. And dialectic, as I'm sure many of your audience knows, is thesis, antithesis, synthesis. So you take one position, you take the opposite, and you synthesize them. And that was Aristotle's attempt to reduce Socratic dialogue into logic. And that move occurred, not just Aristotle was the only person to this, but that move occurred all across with the rise of professional philosophy, because the whole point about being a professional philosopher is you had to figure out how to get people to give you money to take your classes. And the way you did that was you convinced other people that you were more correct than the other philosophers. And the way that you did that was that you had better arguments that embarrassed these other philosophers. And so we ended up in this shift away from narrative and ethics towards metaphysics and arguments that eliminated wisdom literature and hyper-focused on this small number of technical skills, which were not actually related to how you live a happy life, but were related to how you beat other philosophers in discussions and in arguments. And so the first thing I say in the book is that the reason that philosophy has failed is because it's become this internal bubble where philosophers are just using this small set of tools to constantly fight and battle each other. It's a little bit like if you go back in sort of the dinosaur record and you realize that Triceratops developed these increasingly elaborate antlers and horns that were actually useless for hunting, but were very good at jousting other Triceratops. And so you get this form of kind of like, intraspecies competition. And so I talk about, okay, well, that's how philosophy failed, but we can go back and recover what was going on in wisdom literature, and we can actually recover what was going on in Socrates. What was going on in Socrates that Aristotle was trying to reduce to dialectic? Well, if you read any Socratic dialogue, essentially the same basic thing happens, which is the little plot twist. And the way the plot twist works is Socrates walks up to someone who thinks that, he's very smart. And Socrates says to them, well, I'm not smart, so why don't you tell me how you're so smart? And then over the course of this conversation, the person who Socrates is talking with starts to realize, actually, I don't know anything at all. And so there's this plot twist, which is the person who thought they knew everything realizes that they knew nothing. And as a result of that, they develop what we would call self-irony, the ability to think about their past self ironically, which is to say the ability to think of themselves as two people. Now, that's logically impossible. There's a whole history of philosophers getting to this whole thing about how is it possible for the mind to think about itself? Because then the mind would be two things, and that's impossible. Right? The mind can't be two things, right? Logic can't solve this. But narratively, you can solve this very simply. You just say, well, I'm both the narrator and the character of my own story. I'm a narrator and a character at the same time. I'm telling my story and I'm living my story. I'm the I and the me, to use the terms that William James would use in the late 19th century. So the first thing that we see there is that development of self-irony is really important for wisdom, which is a narrative process. I will almost guarantee you that the smartest people in your life are able to laugh at themselves, right? I mean, that's sort of the beginning of a lot of wisdom, to say, oh my goodness, I can't believe I did that. That was totally ridiculous, right? Can't do that in logic. There's no way to laugh at yourself logically, right? But you can do that in narrative. And then the other thing that reveals is that if Socrates can think about himself ironically, if he can be a character in his own story, then he can be other characters too. And he can think about life from the perspective of different characters. And those characters aren't right or wrong. They just have different rules of life. And what that means is that when you're confronted with different situations, you can think like different people. You can have a different toolbox of mental rules and approaches that you can use to solve those problems. Now, in logic, that's very dangerous because it leads you down the road to relativism, or some of these, must be wrong. But in the real world, where diversity wins and where life isn't about relativism, it's simply about a fit between your method and the problem that you're facing, it's incredibly useful. And so what I basically say is that all these narrative abilities were wiped out by philosophers. They were thrown out. And that's why philosophy became so narrow and so useless in the real world. And that's also why AI is accelerating us towards this nightmare future where we keep asking it to do things when it is completely out of step with reality. Having AI solve all of our problems is like going into a college and getting a philosophy professor out and telling them to run the government. And this is one of these things where in the abstract, it seems like a wonderful idea. And of course, every philosophy professor in the world would think, I can do this much better. These disastrous, politicians doing everything wrong. But there's a whole history. The entire foundation of democracy is that one person cannot possibly be intelligent enough to run a country. That's why democracies exist. And more importantly, someone who's spent their entire life in an academic environment, completely useless, totally useless, has no ability to solve real world problems. But yet that's what we're asking AI to do. So the underlying logic, even if AI could be fed with perfect data, which is something you often hear from people, like, the problem isn't the AI, it's the data. We just got to, get it more data, and we've got to purify the data, and AI is only as good as the data. The problem with AI isn't the data. It's the AI. It's the logic. Logic is a tool that is developed to solve a very small number of problems that exist in math. The real world is not math. The real world is characterized by these evolving asymmetric conflicts that require imagination, intuition, all these other narrative functions. And so the moment you put an AI in charge, the only way that it can fix the problem is to kill all the life. That would be the answer from AI's perspective. Kill all the living things, because if I kill all the living things, there's no more problem solved. But if that isn't the solution you want, you're not going to get anything good from AI.
So this is, in a way, story is what allows us to go beyond logic. So it expands the tool set that we have to a greater spectrum of possibilities. It doesn't deny logic or the power thereof. It just says that it is necessary, but it's not sufficient. It doesn't cover the full spectrum. And that kind of a dichotomy is perhaps represented by the fact that, together with the failure of philosophy for the last 2,500 years, and the reason why I'm so much attracted to ancient Stoic philosophy in general, and Socrates in particular, is because they said that if it's not practical, it's not philosophy. So that was the difference between them and what was called to be the natural philosophers, who were more concerned with metaphysics and so on. And the actual philosophers like the Stoics and Socrates, they were all about ethics and practical ethics that you have to live on a daily basis. And you can see that kind of yearning in humanity to have a story by the power of religion, I believe. So religion has been challenged over and over again by logic. But that's not a fortress you can conquer in a logical manner, because humanity craves a story, a powerful story like that, and religion fulfills that need. And that's why to this day it is present. And perhaps this is where I can kind of twist a little bit with something I've been working on. And we talked about my project last time, but so I was working on my book, Rewriting the Human Story. But now here's the latest twist. So I had this friend who is a very successful keynote speaker and runs a podcast for keynote speakers. And he had one episode that drove me off the wall. And the title was like, Content is King, Queen, and Emperor, or something like that. And I was like, no. Content is absolutely not any of those things. It's the context that matters. And so I made this 4-minute keynote speech for him, just for him, that I presented at his event. Why content is not king, context is king. And I argued that the human brain didn't evolve to create content, but to provide context, which is all about the context of our survival originally. And that's the difference. So in a way, the human brain is a filter which provides the context within which every piece of content is either visible if it provides survivability, or it's invisible if it's not relevant towards the context of survivability. And we provide the context. And that's the difference between AI and humanity. A human is a being in search of a context. AI is an entity that's very good at content. Here's the problem, though. Content is useless without context. And the context comes from the framework. And the framework comes from our story. And that's why AI needs reinforced learning and infinite amounts of data, because they're trying to deduce one way or another our story, our framework, which tells them what's the garbage in the data, what's the signal, and what's the noise. So in other words, it's all about the context, not about the content.
Okay.
And this is what I call the context effect.
Let me agree with you and then reframe it in narrative terms and then see, because, so first of all, I completely agree with the difference you're drawing. What computers do is they spam out huge amounts of stuff, and it's actually overwhelming and suffocating. And they can provide infinite content through divergent and convergent thinking. I mean, that's how generative AI works. I mean, generative AI could just literally fill.
And that does more damage than good, as we've seen,
yes,
right? Because then we're searching for meaning even more so, and we're feeling even more lost. So more data doesn't help, it hurts.
That's right. Now, instead of the term context, I'm going to float something else past you, and then you can tell me if you agree or disagree. So the reason I'll push against the term context is the term context is, and it comes to us from interpretation. And so the idea is that you have to understand text through the context. And what that means is that according to this theory, is that you have a frame of significations that allows you to interpret the meaning of this particular word and put it in its larger significance. Now, that is itself a computational process. And so what I usually find is that when people are using words like context, what they're actually using is computer words for human activities which are non-computational. And actually what we're talking about is things like circumstance or environments. And circumstances and environments are actually different from frameworks and context. I can explain a little bit why. To explain why, let's go back to your example of religion. People often say, well, the reason we need religion is because, we need to know the truth, or we need to have meaning in our lives. That's incorrect. Truth and meaning are, again, computational things. If you tell someone the truth, they find it very uninteresting. You discover this very quickly in elementary school. You tell kids all sorts of true things, like 2 + 2 = 4. That's completely true. No one is ever interested in that, right? If I say to you, let us all worship 2 + 2 = 4, people say that's totally pointless. Meaning is another logic function. It's you interpret the significance of something. And it's used to kind of translate between languages. So you might translate between, machine language and ASCII or something like that, Actually, what humans want are not truth and meaning. What they want is purpose and direction. Those are human things. So purpose and direction means I'm going there in this direction,
for this reason.
For this reason to get that thing. Yeah. And another way of saying that is I have my why. Exactly. I know why I'm doing something.
Exactly.
And to go back to what you were talking about in terms of all of this content and identifying things in that content that matter to us, we have that why in our mind. We have that sense of purpose and direction, and we pull the things out of it that fit with that, and then we go forward. Whereas computer, it's not just that it doesn't have at any particular moment why or purpose. It's incapable of having them because those are narrative. Those are narrative.
The content is the what, the context is the why.
That's right. Now, so the reason I think this is important is because people try and fix this problem in computers by giving them frameworks, by giving them symbolic frameworks of meaning. And they can have those. And they can use that to filter out things and identify, which thing matters. But that still doesn't give them purpose or direction or why or any of these narrative things. And so the reason I'm sort of putting it in narrative terms is I just want to kind of make clear to your audience that a lot of times people say, well, you can fix that if you just give them this symbolic architecture, for example. I mean, this is a common thing. And no, you can't, because first of all, that symbolic architecture always has to be hardwired by a human anyway, right? Humans have to put the symbolic architecture into the computer. But what's remarkable about the human brain is that it's constantly generating and regenerating its own symbolic architecture, which is another way of saying it's constantly able to think about how its shifting environment and its shifting place in that environment is changing the opportunities and therefore the purpose and direction it can have. And that imaginative creative capacity is something that computers just totally lack. I mean, that's why they don't get up in the morning and do things.
The context evolves, in other words.
Yes, yeah. So anyway, so I think we completely and utterly agree. And the thing about religion is
for me the story. Let me jump in here. For me, the story is a synonym to the context. Story is context. The context is story. So it's not in those computational terms that you're... The way I came up with context is first to make it sort of like more dialectical or debatable and interesting as a title when I argued my counterpoint to my friend. But secondly, also because it reminded me to a point which Marcus Aurelius makes when he says, the color of your world is the color of your thoughts. And in other words, we all have like a filter in front of our eyes, and that filter comes from our story. And the story that we have like colored glasses in front of our eyes gives meaning to everything we look at. In other words, if you want to look at the same thing with a new set of eyes, you don't change the thing, you change the filter. And the filter is your story, it's your context. So you change the context, you change the meaning of things. That's where the power comes. And that's kind of like the biggest insight for me, at least. That's where it came out. That's where the power is. It's not in the data, it's in the context to shape the data. And when you have a breakthrough or a revolution in historical or technological terms, someone comes and changes the context. And then what used to be valuable suddenly becomes useless, because in the new context, it's useless, right? Change the context and you change the meaning of what is garbage and what is a treasure, right? That's why, during the elections, if you're a keynote speaker, you can't deliver the same keynote speech for both a Trump or a Kamala rally, because the context is very different. So you have to provide different content to fit that context. And that's how one person's garbage is another person's treasure, because their context is different, which allows them to see the same thing differently. Right. And that's where I think it's probably one of the last vestiges of humanity, maybe, that kind of, and again, context for me is story. It's basically, that's our control. As long as we can control the narrative and control the story, we are in charge. We can have that power of the protagonist and agency. But if we lose that, then which I think is perhaps a growing danger, whether consciously or subconsciously, like, then we'll be even in more trouble. And maybe it's kind of happening already now with the vacuum of a story that unites us. That's kind of like the last couple of thoughts were not quite formed yet. But anyway, time is advancing here, and we're already beyond the point. We're like, I think, if I'm not mistaken, both of us are having too much fun here, but the problem is time is advancing and you have to go soon. So let's see if we can move on to your next book, Primal Intelligence. And Tell me more about it. What does it help us with in the world we find ourselves today, and how does it relate to story and AI?
So the purpose of primal intelligence is to provide people who are not philosophers and not narrative theorists with a way of maximizing their narrative intelligence. It's basically maximizing all the things your brain can do that a computer will never do. And the origin story of it is that when I went to work with the Army, I had this theory of imagination, which we then tested. And imagination is different from ideation and these computational processes in the ways that we've talked about. Imagination is your way to make new plans. That's what imagination is. So we did all that. And as we were doing that, the Army said to me, they said, "Oh, this is great, Angus. We love this theory of imagination. This is totally wonderful." And they said, "But where do you think plans come from? Where do you think they come from?" And I said, "Well, I mean, they come from imagination. That's what we've been just talking about." And they said, "No, no, 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 no. Imagination is what allows you to create these plans, but ultimately plans come from opportunities. A plan is a response to an opportunity that your brain sees. So before your brain can imagine, it has to spot an opportunity. And how does it spot the opportunity? It doesn't do so with imagination. It does so with intuition. And so if we're going to train imagination, we also need to train intuition. Now, when I heard this, I first thought they were nuts because, first of all, I had this view that intuition was kind of like a magic-y thing. It's like intuition, and because there's a long history of the idea going back through like Emerson and the Transcendentalists that intuition is kind of like a gift from the supernatural. There's also in people like Daniel Kahneman and modern cognitive science, the opposite view that intuition is simply pattern recognition. And that's what we mean by intuition. And so the idea that you could have intuition in this other sense that was not magical and that was not logical, it didn't make any sense to me at first. But I came to understand it by talking to the Army in terms of something that they had called exceptional information. And I won't go into too much detail about it, but basically exceptional information is something that breaks a known rule. You have a whole bunch of rules in your head and then an exception occurs. And then what do you do with that exception? Well, if you're a computer, you hop over it, yeah, exactly. Yeah. But if you're a human, you say, wait a minute, maybe that exception is the future. Maybe that exception is actually the beginning of a whole new story or a whole new story world even. Maybe there's something really special there. And so then the operator said to me, so intuition is real. It's this ability. It's a natural ability. Everybody has it, but we get better at it over time. We train ourselves to get better at intuition. So it's not just a natural power. It's something you can learn to get better at. And so in Primal Intelligence, I talk about imagination, but then I also talk about intuition and talk about all these techniques that we have for training up intuition and learning how to get better at spot opportunities in your environment and how you can kind of take these brain processes from the operator. So those are two parts of it. But then the question becomes, you have all these plans. What plans do you use? What are the plans you actually use? Because we've all met people who are great at coming up with plans and they never accomplish anything in their lives, or have all these plans that just don't come to anything. And if you're an operator, you've always got to be picking the right plan for the situation. To use your term, the right plan for the context. You've got to know, this is the plan that I do now for this audience, or this is the plan that I do now for this mission or this operation. So where does that come from? Well, that comes from a third narrative power called common sense. And I talk in the book, there's a whole little story in there about how I went through the operators and their common sense training, and I got a 0, which actually is worse than 0. I mean, it was so low, they were just amazed that a professor, that even a professor could get that bad, but literally absolutely no common sense whatsoever. And I then learned how they trained it up. And as I learned how they trained it up, I realized this is another narrative process. I break down the narrative process in the book. I kind of explain where that comes from and, again, why it's not possible for logic. I mean, I think everybody at this point has agreed that AI does not have common sense, right? That computers do not have common sense. And it's not a data problem because people with very little information can still have a lot of common sense. So I talk about the narrative of that, how you train up your common sense. And then finally, you've got your intuition, so you're spotting opportunities. You've got your imagination, so you're turning those opportunities into plans. You've got your common sense, so you're picking the right plan for your situation, so you're always being maximally effective in that situation. Then the final piece of the puzzle is you. Because your job in life isn't just to be a special operator. Your job in your life is to be you and to have your own story and to be the operator of your own life. Where does that come from? And so what I talk about in the book is how that comes from the fourth power, which is not a narrative power, but which is connected to narrative. And that fourth power is emotion. And your emotions are very good at helping guide you in terms of what's right for you and what's wrong for you. And we find that's why people have different emotional responses in different situations. And so what I talk about in the book is how you kind of train up all four of these powers in your brain. The first three powers, intuition, imagination, and common sense, are narrative. The fourth power, emotion, is non-narrative but connected. So together they make up your primal intelligence as opposed to just your narrative intelligence. And I talk about how, I work with the operators to develop training for all of these, and then how I took that training and simplified it. And, we put it into businesses. And, more importantly, I think we've trained parents and we've trained kids with it. And so the book kind of walks through all that. That's the first half of the book. And in the second half of the book talks about how those processes, once you train them up, lead to things like innovation, resilience, decision-making, coaching, and finally leadership. And I talk about the processes involved there and how you can, combine intuition and imagination to improve an innovation, if that's something you're interested in, or how you can take emotion and intuition and combine that to improve your resilience and things like that. And so that's kind of the big architecture of the book. But basically, it's all the stuff in your head that you're not learning how to use in school, but that evolved to keep your ancestors alive, and that is your best opportunity to live your life successfully.
That's wonderful. And it's tremendously useful, of course. But before you can improve any of those things, you have to first set up your benchmark. And based on your questionnaire, I tried to set up my benchmark. So I followed your questions. And here's my results. So, and it's a scale. I don't know if it's from 0 to 10, but these are my results. So intuition. The first thing that I did was answer questions, and I got 10 on intuition. Imagination, 0 on imagination. So that to me was a shocker. Intuition, 10, imagination, 0. Emotion, 5. And common sense, 2. So, in other words, somehow I have high intuition, 0 imagination, I'm okay on emotion, and I'm low on common sense, which kind of, I guess, doesn't throw me too far from Socrates. So it keeps me in good company. And at least that was kind of a bit of a, a relief to me. But would you care to make any comments, and what does this say about me?
Yeah. So first of all, the scale is actually from -10 to 10. So my common sense is a -10 on that scale. So you're actually doing very well, I would say. A 0 just means you're a neutral, basically. So most of your stuff is in neutral or in positive territory. So you're doing pretty good. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that these scores are relative to each other. So if you have a 10 intuition, that doesn't mean that you have the best intuition of anybody on earth. That just means that your intuition is your leading ability. And I think that's true with you, because based on our interactions, you have an uncanny ability to spot things that are special, to spot things that are remarkable, to spot opportunities. You see the future faster. That's what we talk about when we talk about with intuition is people have this ability to see things before other people do. And so you score very high at intuition. And that's something that I absolutely believe based on our encounters. I also think that the fact that emotion is your second highest score makes a lot of sense to me based on that story you told me about your parents. You had a very strong sense of internal purpose. Emotion reveals your ability, essentially your self-knowledge and your sense of self-purpose and self-direction. And I think that combined with the fact that you've been willing to be a gadfly, you've been willing to be a contrarian in your life. If you have a low emotion score, that means you tend to kind of go along with what other people say and do because you have less of that kind of internal compass. And so I think those two make a lot of sense. As far as common sense and imagination, the good news is that I score low on both of those too, and those are actually very easy to train. So if you want, you can get them both up pretty quickly. Common sense, I mean, you're a fairly academic guy, you're a fairly abstract guy. It doesn't surprise me that your common sense is not your leading score. Like when we see people whose common sense is their leading score, they tend to be sort of like industrialists or things like that. You know what I mean? They're just very practical, Yeah. And, as far as, imagination goes, really what we're looking for there is, can your mind see 3, 4, 5 possible ways to every goal? Or is it constantly trying to fix or focus on one? And so, the best way to start to kind of open up your imagination is really to have a tolerance for ideas that your judgment might kill early on. Because your judgment might say, you know what, that's a low probability thing, let's get rid of it. But actually, a lot of low probability things have their day. They have moments when they win. And so a lot of times judgment is killing those things too fast. And particularly when I work with people in computer science, or who have a kind of like strong kind of like technical or mathematics background, they do struggle with imagination because they kill a lot of their creative ideas too quickly, because they're evaluating them in terms of probability as opposed to possibility. So, I mean, now, having said all that, your imagination still could be stronger than mine because, as I said, it's not an absolute score, it's a relative score. But it does seem that that might be the area that if you bulked up on that, that would accelerate kind of all of these other narrative processes, and it would allow your intuition to feed more, and it would give your emotion kind of more range to work, and so on and so forth.
Definitely. And, I do have a history of prejudging and killing imaginative ideas with low probability on the one hand. And on the other hand, my whole life and everything that I've done that's worth anything has been basically against the odds. I've always been outside of the reasonable curves and whatever in any way possible. So that's kind of like the dichotomy, if you will, that I'm struggling with.
Well, people who have high intuition, as you do, and high emotion have high life purpose. I mean, because what they're able to do is they're able to see the exceptional in others, but also the exceptional in themselves. That's what intuition is. It's about spotting exceptions. And so I think that squares really strongly with what you're doing. I also think that the fact that you came on this podcast and read out your own scores, including the negative one, or including the lower ones, proves that you have high life purpose and proves that you have high emotion, because people who have low emotion don't like to talk about negative things with regards to themselves. Like you would have instead been like, what, actually, Angus, I got a 7 on imagination. And I actually did all this work with, they will remain nameless, but they were a group of faculty, and their scores were all improbably high. And I was like, this is just, because I know these people. It's like, they're not, and you just realize that it was because they actually had very low emotion scores and they didn't want to acknowledge that. And so they artificially inflated them. And so I think, to me, more than anything else, what that proves is that you have incredibly high life purpose. And that really, you were asking me earlier about how do we change the world? How do we change the world? That's really, if you solve the imagination piece of this, if you start to grow your imagination, that's going to allow you to connect your strong sense of purpose with this larger effect by being able to make more of these big scale plans. So anyway, that's my informal assessment of you. And as I said, this is coming from someone with low common sense. So take that maybe with a grain of salt.
Well, that's wonderful. Okay, so we have to be out the door in the next, hopefully, 10 minutes, because I know you have a hard cutoff point. Where does that leave us here? I wanted to talk a lot more about AI and especially challenge a little bit more about those things that kind of perked up a couple of times, like AI would never do this, like AI would never be creative, and AI would never be able to do this. And my concern with that is twofold. So first is, those are famous last words. And, Isaac Asimov's, was it first law, says that if a respectable old scientist says that something is impossible, he's most likely wrong, right? Because that's what aging scientists tend to do. They tend to tell you what's impossible, and in time, they're usually proven to be wrong. So I'm concerned about that. But also in the last 18 to 24 months, perhaps, we have witnessed arguably a tremendous amount of progress in AI. Let me share with you my kind of sideways, but very kind of representative, maybe Turing test level. I learned to bake in the last few months with ChatGPT. And the way I've done it is basically take a recipe, start baking, bake the bread, take pictures of it, share it with ChatGPT, and then it tells me what I did wrong and how I can improve it on the next time. And I have a neighbor who ran a bakery for 40 years, and I made a bread for her one day, and she told me I can open up my own bakery.
That's incredible.
Yeah,
that's incredible.
But
yeah.
that only, and I've baked 30 or 40 breads in my entire life, and that happened. She's baked thousands upon thousands per day for 30 years or 40 years. And I only did that with pictures with ChatGPT.
Sure. ChatGPT helped you to do something that people already knew how to do. So I don't deny that, right? I mean, I don't deny that. So let me talk about the first thing. I'll talk about the second thing. And then you feel free to push back on me because believe me, people have been telling me for 3 years that I'm nuts. And the last time that we talked, I believe we were on Chat GPT 3 or whatever, or GPT-3,
yes,
right? So there seems to have been this explosion. Okay. Well, if I said to you, will we ever eat soup with a knife? Right? I mean, maybe we could kind of eat soup with a knife, but we can all tell that that's never actually going to happen. Why? Because mechanically, it's just not a fit for the task. And that's what I'm saying here is mechanically, once you understand the hardware of AI, it's not a fit for the things we're asking it to do. Will we ever build a perpetual motion machine? Well, possibly if all the laws of known physics are incorrect, but that seems highly unlikely. And that's again where we are with AI. But we understand about the laws of logic if they don't permit it to do these kinds of things. And so that's the stance that I'm making. I'm not making it because I'm a Luddite. I'm not making it because I'm like, kids, get off my lawn with your new technologies. I'm saying because you have to understand the underlying mechanics of a technology to use it. And when you understand the underlying mechanics of a technology, that gives you respect for what it can do, but also understanding what it does not do. You would not use your lawnmower to try and make toast. So that's really where that's coming from. It's not coming from a kind of a Luddite perspective. To your other point about, you've learned these things from ChatGPT. I mean, I certainly don't doubt that ChatGPT, like other kinds of AI, and I think let's be clear here that ChatGPT and these chatbots, which are now confused with AI, are a very specific subsector, right? I think we all agree of AI. They're these large language models. They can be very, very good at automating highly information dense, stable processes. So in other words, if we've done a task a lot, and baking is a great example of a very stable task, as opposed to say cooking or something like that.
Yeah.
I think you'd have a harder time learning cooking from ChatGPT.
Baking is very precise.
Yes, exactly. Right. So if you're talking about those kinds of tasks, of course, these systems can be very helpful in helping you helping you kind of like, automate them. And there's a place for automation. And to put this in perspective, automation is an obsession of the late 19th century with the rise of the Industrial Revolution. It became the basis of management theory in the early 20th century because of people like Frederick Taylor and this idea that we could get more productivity out of organizations if we squeezed out the inefficiency by figuring out essentially how to kind of like automate all of these processes so that every day I wasn't going into the office and learning how to rewrite an email, right? That takes a lot of time. If I have to send out 25 emails over the course of a day, and then every time I have to think to myself, what do I put in this email? As opposed to I always have a template. And then what? I don't have a template. I have ChatGPT, and ChatGPT is going to create it for me, right? And so if there's a process that you run all the time that's just an incredibly basic process that's like that, of course, automation can help you. The problem is that most human-to-human interactions just don't work that way because the other person is not remaining stable. Your client, your customer is not remaining stable. The people on your team are not remaining stable. They're evolving.
We're open systems, all of us within an open system.
That's the key word, is open system. Yeah, you've just got it. So I mean, this is the thing. If it's a closed system, and there are certain kinds of closed systems, we can create artificially closed systems.
Logical systems are closed systems.
Logical systems are closed systems. Yeah. Narrative systems are open systems. Narrative systems evolve to handle new information and new challenges. And so to be clear, that's my critique of AI. I'm not someone who's like, oh my goodness, but I will say that generally we know, and there's a ton of research. I mean, there have been papers that are published in the last couple of months on this. I'm sure you're aware of them in places like Nature and whatnot, which have shown, first of all, that even though using ChatGPT seems to increase individual creativity, it decreases group creativity. So that individuals seem like they're getting more creative in terms of where they were, but the group as a whole is getting less creative. And that's because what we're having, there's a phenomenon known as popularity bias, or kind of, a gravitational pull, essentially, where the machine pulls us into the dominant paradigm, into the dominant pattern, and it makes us all brittle. And so instead of opening possibilities and allowing us not only to exist in open systems, but to open our own system, it's trapping us increasingly within.
What about Move 38?
What about what?
Move 38.
I don't think I know Move 38. You gotta educate me. No.
Yeah, that was like the famous move in the first Go battle when AlphaGo played Lee Sedol of Korea, and everything was predictable and expected, etc. Until a famous move in the second or third game, I forget, which is called Move 38, if I remember, that was completely groundbreaking and is often given as an example of groundbreaking creativity that no human would have ever played before.
So I think I don't know that example, but I know a similar example that happened in chess with Deep Blue. And it turns out that actually the computer was just acting randomly. So what ended up happening was it could, there was an unsolvable mathematical problem. There were sort of multiple equivalencies, and so it just acted randomly in that situation. So that's of course a capacity of ChatGPT. In all these systems, they have the capacity just to act randomly. But that's different from intentional creativity, which, as we've talked about, is narrative. So the question is, can you brute force the future through a mix of haphazardness and existing patterns? And people who believe in AI will tell you, yes, that's what innovation comes from. I will tell you no. That's not to say that I'm correct, but I will just tell you that most of the creativity that's occurred on this earth has not been haphazard. It's been the result of a method developed by that creative as they focused in on their kind of rule system and have doubled down on it. If you want, I can tell you a story about that.
In other words,
we can talk
we're
about
running out
else.
of time, though.
Okay, that's okay. Yep.
In other words, what you're saying is that narrative intelligence or story is essential for our future, or positive future anyway. Maybe even for our survival.
Oh, it's definitely important for our survival as humans. It's also important for our joy and our fulfillment as humans and our sense of life direction. You're not going to get direction unless you can create your own narrative.
Yeah, I totally agree with that too, because it all comes down to can you get an ought from an is? That's the debate, right? Logic can give you an is, but narrative can give you an ought, what you should do, right? And you cannot extrapolate the should or the ought to do from what is, right? They're kind of separated, I think. And that's where the context takes precedence over the content. And I think it's actually of higher importance because it gives meaning to the content. And that's why I'm with you that narrative, at least as far as I can tell and see, takes precedent over computers, just like because it pushes us beyond logic, beyond the limit of logic and math. And the world that's possible for us must be beyond those limitations if we are to solve our current problems. And I see, equally like you, by the way, I'm skeptical of like people who many peers in the singularity and transhumanist community, and that's one of the reasons why I've had many problems with that, is like people believe it's like the silver bullet. It's like, let's get AI, it's going to solve everything. Cancer, war, poverty, you name it, AI is going to solve it. We're going to live in a utopia afterwards because, and to me, those are not, this, as you say, the tool is not it's not right for the job. It's like eating soup with a knife, as you said.
Yeah. I mean, and, we know this, as we talked about in the last podcast, because the human brain has evolved both logic and narrative. And those have both been around in the human brain for hundreds of millions of years, and one has not beaten out the other. Why? Because they're both useful. So I think in the future, we can imagine that AI could be a helpful partner in certain ways. But I think it's important to remember that even the best AI is designed and implemented by humans. And also, to use your language about ought versus is, I think it's important to remember that ought changes based on the situation, or to use your term, the context. And different things are appropriate in different situations. And that's not something that's going to satisfy an AI. An AI is going to look for the optimum solution and is going to try and impose that in every situation. And as a human being, you're just not going to be happy if you're constantly inhabiting someone else's optimum solution. We've all had that in our lives where we've walked into someone else's house and they've got it perfectly laid out for them. And, it's okay, but like, we don't want that. We want our own house laid out for us. And that sense of the diversity of life, that sense of the opportunity, the adaptability, the flexibility, the variety of life, that's something which AI is just never going to understand. And that's fine because that's its unique strength.
I feel it may be true what you just said. I'm not 100% convinced that it will be true. I believe I may be wrong. You may be wrong. We may be wrong. But I feel the same way as you. But because I'm very kind of Socratic. I love the exceptions. I live for them. I kind of like work out from the exceptions, if you will, which is weird for a computer. But we're in the last 3 minutes. Angus, please tell me quickly, where can people find more about you and your work? And what's the final parting message that you want to send us with? Because we kind of went all over a few things. I tried to cover 2 books in our conversation, one published, one unpublished. And so we had this kind of meandering conversation. I hope people enjoy it as much as I did.
Okay, so if people want to find me, first of all, I think if you just Google Angus and Ohio, I'm pretty sure I'm the only Angus in Ohio, and I'll come up. You can also, I've got a website, angusfletcher.co, and I run a little think tank. It's called Operation Human. So if you want to go to operationhuman.com and kind of check out what we're doing, it's all kind of zany stuff. It involves a lot of art and special operations. So if those 2 things happen to be things you're interested in, then you will enjoy the combination. If I had to leave with one parting message, I would say that the thing that's most important for us to cultivate in ourselves and our communities is leadership. Leadership is taking the first step. You know that you're leading when you don't know what the right answer is. That's our uniquely human capacity. That is what distinguishes us from AI. And if you're looking to nurture leadership in others, I would encourage you to do one simple thing. Tell them that they did something smart that you would not have done. So if you see someone doing something that's smart and you wouldn't have done that, say, that's smart and I would not have done it. Because what that's saying right there is you have led. And I think a lot of times in the world, I see people doing the opposite thing, which is that's different from what I would have done. It's wrong. Or you could do it better if you did it this way. Or let me tell you how to do it, right? So going around and telling people, especially young people, that was really smart and I wouldn't have done it that way. That's how you build leaders. That's how you cultivate a more human future.
Wow. What a place to end. Angus Fletcher, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, and anytime.